interest jobs have been found on PAYE schemes in the UK, which just shows the extent to which unemployment is rising, given since the start of the pandemic. So that has huge implications on people's ability to not just spend, but also to raise credit and to be able to invest in all the different categories, from many of whom the businesses that attend these sessions will be greatly affected by that. In terms of retail, obviously non-essential shopping opened this week, so it's interesting to see the response. Lots of hype and interest, from the high street, but does that translate into numbers? Does it translate into sales? And what can we expect? In terms of, I think more of a positive move this week, the government have done a U-turn on enabling those vulnerable children in homes that not necessarily have such high disposable income, with being able to provide access to school meals throughout the summer. So that's going to help a lot of people out at quite a difficult time. And in terms of employment, what we're seeing in the data is actually some of the biggest losses in jobs are around younger generations. So they're more likely to feel the pinch of not just furlough schemes, but unemployment throughout this period. And that's going to have quite a big impact on different categories. And I'll explain why in a bit more detail later as we go through. But it's quite a worrying sign, particularly for brands that have been focusing on this type of audience for a while. So in terms of what people are looking forward to, what we're seeing, we put this question into the research. We asked people, what are you looking forward to the most post-pandemic? And what we're seeing overall, we see evidence that people are looking forward to spending time with family and friends and to be able to see and taste and experience things. But there is increasingly evidence of consumer behaviour coming into that desire. So this week, 4% of the UK said they're looking forward to shopping, and that's up in the most more recent weeks. So we've seen that tracking very steadily at about 1% for the past 5 weeks or so, until last week we saw it jump up to 3%, and now it's at 4%, giving it space in the top 10 things that people are looking forward to. The pub remains relatively steady, around 6%, and holiday and travel again is the category where people are most looking forward to when it comes to a commercial type activity. So it's quite curious, and I think what's also interesting is to look at the type of language people use. We're seeing the word back appear quite a lot more compared to normal, which indicates that people are pining for some reality that is at least a little bit similar to what they were used to before. In terms of how people are feeling, for those that have been on these sessions before, we've been honing on this data quite a lot because there's been such dramatic changes, and we're now seeing an increasing balance in between the emotions that we're feeling. Still, overall, the predominant feel in the UK is one of worry. So 35% of people currently feel worried about things, but we've now got 24% of people in the UK who say they feel restless, and 16% of people feel content. And that gives rise to quite an interesting picture, where you've essentially got very different responses to the pandemic in terms of how people feel, and that will ultimately have quite a bit of an impact with regard to how they're likely to behave in the coming months. So if you look at the latest retail news, so obviously non-essential retail opened this week. Although we might have seen, by the way, if you can hear any chirping in the background, that's my cat. He's been quite demanding for this afternoon, so I have decided to let him loose. I promise he won't be that annoying. But we've, in terms of footfall, week on week, we've seen an increase of 39% in the UK. So that's partly a positive news for retailers. But if you look at it compared to same time last year, footfall's down by a third, and certainly the news, reading a lot of the trade press, would suggest that the struggle could continue for quite a long time. And if you think about how people feel emotionally, if you've got a heightened level of anxiety and worry, and you're certainly the type of individual that doesn't, is not comfortable going outside, be it for health reasons or just for general anxiety, that is going to affect your willingness to go into store and to shop in ways you would have done before, or fancy, carefree sort of manner you might have done previously. So this is going to have a big impact on people's intentions to engage in the high street. Another key theme to bear in mind, which I talked about earlier on, is just also the increasing financial pressures. And I mentioned at the top that one of the age groups that are going to be most affected by joblessness are young employees. Often in challenging times for many businesses, you're going to be looking to try and keep members of your team who've got experience and kind of cope with certain things. But there's real concern that looking like 9% of those aged between 18 and 24 have lost their jobs altogether, which is the highest of any group out there. And this is really concerning, not just for a whole generation of people who we have no idea how this is going to play out. It could be a short-term issue, but I read something recently. They predict this is going to be, we're going to feel the pinch. The current estimations are for 3 years for the economy to come back on track. Now that's kind of guessing. It could be 3 years, it could be shorter, it could be longer. Certainly, the experience that we've had over the last 10 years, it's taken us quite a bit of time to move out of the previous recession, and we're into quite a deep one in a very sharp moment. So for lots of particular retailers and any businesses and organizations that deal with more commercial aspects as opposed to sort of more socially driven ones, the concern is about how do you go to market and how do you engage with them. And for those of you that are looking at it more socially, then it's about getting the tone right, and it's about trying to offer support to these types of people. I think, interestingly, just anecdotally, working a lot in sort of retail and different sectors, we always get excited about having to sort of design experiences for young people. They're more exploratory. The behaviours are always fascinating. It's always a fascination for people to discuss what millennials are doing. Well, hopefully by the end of this presentation, I'll convince you that you need to start rethinking that, because there's some data later on that shows where the direction of travel is for shifting from in-store to online is very much the domain of older generations. And another key thing we need to bear in mind, and this is really in the kind of more, again, the macro context, we spoke to parents as part of a little project we did with the Institute of Professional Advertisers, the IPA, a couple of weeks ago, and we found that prior to the supposed reopenings of the schools, 65% of parents just didn't support it. The main reason was they felt worried, but at home they are struggling to balance home and life. And this is really important for just thinking through, how can we start to predict what might happen next? What sort of things, what types of behaviours could we start to observe? And if you're addressing that question, I can't really sort of do it justice in an hour-long webinar, but if you think about behaviours and how how patterns of habits form, not only have you got to kind of consider it, with the thinking about the brain and how we feel emotionally and how we process information, but you've also got to think about the environment in which we're in and how we interact with that environment. And habit formation is really a component of all these things. It's the psychology, it's the ability to interact with the environment that you're in. All these three things are going to have a huge impact. There's no sort of kind of clear way in which that will play a role, but if I was to illustrate, what is, if you think about it in terms of if transport is limited, let's say, for example, that people aren't the people aren't willing to get on public transport and actually either work from home or decide to take a car into town. Well, what's the impact on the takeaway coffee market? Or what's the impact of people doing less traveling on the price of oil? And what does that then mean for the price of plastics? And what does that then mean for everything is so interconnected? Particularly when you think about how we're feeling emotionally in the UK, as I spoke about earlier, we're now seeing that huge diversity, and that's going to become more pronounced in the coming weeks. So for anyone that's in a marketing or product development position, I think we really need to spend our time listening and start to identify where those kind of micro changes and habits are with different types of cohorts. It's quite a big challenge to unpick, but I think where we are now, we're probably in a better position to start to predict some of this stuff if we're using the right type of data sources to do that. And again, thinking about this has got huge regional variation. So, habits will be based on how people feel, how able they are to move about in their environment. And if you just look at how things change, environmentally across different regions. So if you compare Manchester, for example, you've got, since the pandemic, this is data from Google, by the way, it's really fascinating. You'll see that there's been a 10% increase in time spent in residential areas, but a 67% reduction compared to the baseline in retail and recreation, and public transport, similar sort of numbers, around 62. Compare that to Worcestershire, which this week happens to be the domain of bad internet. Where I currently am for this week. It's quite a different pattern. So you've seen that the level of reduction in public transport is 36%. So there's quite a bit of a difference. And Worcestershire is a kind of area where you get a lot of car travel, public services like buses, particularly through kind of rural areas that there just aren't any. That was stripped away many years ago. So we have to think about the kind of environment and our ability to interact with it and how that will change depending on the geography. So it's not only going to be, about sort of city centres versus rural city centres. It's also going to have the way that councils have control over certain regions will also have an impact in terms of that change in behaviour over time. So in terms of things we need to bear in mind is really there's going to be huge variation, and we need to be able to be willing to embrace it and understand it. I think any research projects that companies are working on, we're finding at the moment that clients are less inclined to do things in just simple isolation. They're looking at things more over a period of time just to understand how things are moving, which is, I think, more sensible. It also means there's no real kind of rest for anybody. We really need to be, listening as best as we can to how things are moving. And in terms of a service design, I was talking to our head of tech at Rare, and I think this is one of the conversations we've been having internally around how really businesses need to build out for optionality at this point, because there is so much uncertainty, and as much as we are seeing things go back to relative normal, we've got outbreaks happening over in Hong Kong, we've got outbreaks now happening in Madrid inside Europe, and that will, of course, will extend our ability to get back to whatever normal looks like. So there's a lot of uncertainty about things, but if you've built yourself like an all-terrain vehicle in a way, rather than a Ferrari, it means that you've got more options. You might not be able to run the quickest, but you can certainly be able to cater for different types of needs. And I think when it comes down to service design, we need to think about these things when we're exploring where we could take things. And we need to reconcile both short-term issues with revenue generation with long-term planning. So there's always going to be a problem for lots of companies to just go hammer down on sales, try and think sort of short-term, solve the problem, but ultimately where we're going and experiences we're designing need to be thought of in a long-term way. Now we can create sustainable revenue. All of those 5 things are just topics in their own right, but I just want to touch upon it now because I think it's something we all need to consider. We're going to be covering more of the innovation and ideas side of things on our on the Ideas and Innovations webinar on the 15th of July. So we're going to talk about it in a bit more detail. So as I mentioned, how is it going to change the journey? So again, I previewed some of this data last week on a interim data set, and I did caveat very heavily, this data we're still in field with this research, so we'll have something more up to date this week. It's really curious now. This is an analysis of looking at the change in movement between shops, in store, and online, and other means of acquiring or discovering products. We've looked at this data in 2 ways. We've looked at it in terms of where do people go for information when they're making a decision, where do they go when they purchase. The data I've got here just in front of you is around discovery. So it's the kind of, we wanted to know what types of channels did people use prior to the pandemic, and what type of channels do they claim they're going to be using in the future. Now, of course, how they actually behave will be different ultimately, because what you'll find is that we can't really predict, as I said before, how things are going to play out and change. But what this does show to you is in the customer journey where people are finding out information and trying to understand what decisions to make. We can see that there's quite a bit of a shift from in-store to online. So there's a movement, a net movement of 9% there in clothing up there. And down here you can see a 10% movement in gifting, which is really interesting, particularly in the customer journey. So what are the implications? Well, when people are evaluating their choices, you're really going to have to get your digital estate up to scratch and on par with other people. It's going to further exacerbates the drive for change in businesses. And when you look at where people go to make that purchase decision, again, it's quite curious to see how that changes when they come to purchase. So we can see in clothing, we see a swing of about 16% in terms of the difference between online and in store, and we see 20% in sports. So there's real quite large variations. And I think looking at that data, what's also quite interesting is that you'll see with aspects and journeys that are associated more with kind of a research journey where you spend a little bit more time in market discovering. So for example, gifting, you'll see that that has exacerbated the time spent online, and the same is the case when it comes down to purchasing. With furniture products, for example, it's not something you'd be buying necessarily every week. It's something you might buy occasionally with moving home, redoing your house, etc. And something we've seen a bit of a growth since the pandemic. Obviously, lots of people spending time investing in their home, but that 20% shift is in that category where people do generally tend to spend more time in that kind of research mindset, as opposed to something like food. We're still seeing a 12% shift, but it's something you do every day. So even with daily rituals that we've got, there is quite a bit of dynamicism with how things might change. So in terms of the sectors, running through the results for grocery, the lead kind of thing to take away this week, I think, is that there's real hope for lots of the independent retailers out there. So we've seen in our data set that outdoor markets grew by 2%. You've got 1 in 10 people in urban areas who are visiting their local fruit and veg store. And coupled with that, you've got household decision makers who are 3% less likely to visit the supermarket this week. So the indication there is that there's a movement now towards smaller retailers. We've seen in our data that currently 50% of the UK feel a sense of community with their local area, and that can very well be played out in the way that they're interacting with this category at the moment. I thought it was quite interesting to see some of the innovations that are going on in this space. So this is from Aldi, who've trying to control people's interaction with the stores and control the number of people in store. They've put in a traffic light system, which is it's quite kind of interesting, taking probably what looks quite kind of industrious and a little bit sort of bit faceless, but ultimately this is the trade-off a lot of retailers are going to have to make, is how do you ensure the safety but ensure a compelling experience. And this could well be a feature into the near future. But certainly overall, the behaviour in this category is relatively stable, but there does seem to be some movement towards more the independents. In terms of the shift I mentioned early on about the change in journey that we might expect. So currently, of all decision makers in the UK, 75% of them, when it comes, household decision makers when it comes to food, 75% of them would, prior to the pandemic, would prefer to buy in store. What we're seeing is that actually you've got 11% of household decision makers who would now translate that purchase or would prefer to do that in the future to an online channel. You see less degrees of movement across channels that people were doing before the pandemic. So the direction of travel in this sector is certainly towards online. And what we're also seeing is in terms of the demographic of that is very much driven by an older generation. So it has huge, really big consequences for anyone in sort of service design roles, anyone who's designing experiences for different age groups. We've potentially now got a whole new cohort that that perhaps hadn't necessarily been considered. And if you think of it in these terms, if we've got joblessness or loss of the rates of loss of jobs currently is highest amongst those who are younger. They're the ones who also have got the kind of issues around financing in the future. We've got older generations who've got more disposable income, and they're interestingly going to be spending more time online. You've kind of got this double compression in terms of the market, because ultimately what it means is that the younger people are going to be less able to spend or potentially take risks, broadly speaking, of course, whilst older generations will have the income, but potentially will spend less, are less likely to spend time online compared to younger generations. So it's quite a complex thing we need to balance out. But certainly, I think we're going to need to really, for lots of businesses, are going to have to, really review how they approach this cohort. It's kind of like Silver Surfers 2.0, I think, if that's the phrase. In terms of travel, we're seeing that people are still very much in the planning phase, and the attitudes toward destinations remain relatively stable. So baby boomers are typically opting for staycations, and we've got Gen Zs of the group that are more likely to opt to holidays abroad, whereas millennials are quite happy with both sets. We are seeing high degree, well, not high degree, I suppose it's probably relatively modest in the overall picture, but certainly in terms of more recent behaviours, I think it's encouraging to see 13% of the UK evaluating the cost of holiday destinations. It's clearly they're getting into that mindset and they're thinking about it, and you've got 21% of those living with their family who are setting aside money to plan. So the ambition is there, the intention is there, but again, it's going to be interesting to see the change in patterns. Certainly, if people have been paying off debts, which we have seen in the pandemic, there's been quite an interesting trend of people paying off any outstanding debts they've got as we get into the kind of the cyclone of the unknown, and people are less able to raise credit because they haven't got the jobs. That's going to have a big impact in terms of where they're going to go on holiday, if they're going to go on holiday. So I think a lot of UK destinations may well benefit, but of course local service providers are going to have to think about how we can optimize coping with the demand, which is going to be different to what we've seen before. I thought this was really cool. This was from the Faroe Islands. They've obviously you can't get there. They weren't accepting people traveling there for a while, but what they have done is created a remote control virtual tourist guide. So they've got people on the island who, between the hours of 2 to 5 o'clock in the afternoon, they get connected up with cameras, I think GoPro cameras, and they travel around the island, and you can ask them to go to certain places, and you can really explore. I think it's a really nice way of demonstrating, the environment you're in. It's another way of just making sure that they can, share the experience with other people. In terms of the entertainment market, so we're seeing overall that it's slightly down compared to last week, in particular for music. We've seen a 4% decrease there, but interestingly, TV viewing is up, and that's probably related to the weather of last week that we're seeing. It's interesting to see, how that plays out across the different measures that we're looking at, and how that's evolved over time. It's been a relatively stable category, but there's an indication, of course, as people go back to work and we try to get the economy moving again, we'll probably see different kind of habits creeping in. So it'd be interesting to see how podcasts change there. You've seen a slight move from 16 to 18%. One hypothesis could be that's people having to go back on the daily commutes, and podcasting is very much something that's associated with that type of behaviour. It's also interesting to see that learning new creative skills remains relatively steady there at 18%. So we're still seeing a lot of people engaging in new creative skills at this particular point. When it comes to home and DIY, this has been a category that's performed really well over the past few weeks. Overall, we're seeing that there's evidence the engagement is slightly is declining slightly, although we're seeing 23% of the UK taking out DIY tasks. It was 20 the week before. In terms of the overall numbers, it is slightly down on what we're seeing. Typically, you're seeing around 3 in 10 people engaging in the category since the pandemic began. But we're also seeing evidence that people are bringing in contractors, so that's increased from 7% to 9%. So obviously, this will have an impact in terms of people's intention to engage in the category into the future. But it will be interesting to see, of course, whether we do get people who feel more inclined to try out doing DIY into the future. Certainly, the evidence from a lot of the retail press is that this is a sector that's performed extremely well. There's lots of open opportunity within it. And again, in terms of where it's moving, what we're seeing for decision makers in DIY, 67% of them would typically prefer to buy in store, and 50% of decision makers will continue with that behaviour. But there is a quite a large movement. 1 in 5 people who typically buy in store intend to buy online into the future, and it's going to have quite a bit of an impact on the sector itself. How do you keep up with the demand? I saw an article on the Guardian today about Kingfisher Group hiring more people, DPD hiring 6,000 new staff to cope with this demand. And as people get used to being able to transact online, they might decide actually that's going to become the norm for them. And again, looking at where that change is as a balance of demographics, it's predominantly older generations and those with children who are the ones who are shifting. As for retail, we've seen there are some signs of growth. So as we mentioned up top of the presentation, we've got 4% of the UK who are looking forward to shopping again and being able to get out there. So we know that it's top of mind and people are thinking about it. But there is some nuance in the data. So it would seem that actually where there's potential opportunities with younger generations, so 31% of millennials bought clothes last week, which is up 10% on the week before. And there's some real quite interesting sort of variations in the data that we can see. In terms of the different categories and how they're performing, this is the week, actually probably the first week since we're measuring things, where the gap between hobbies and everything else is closing. It's been diminishing slightly over the past few weeks, obviously as people having to get back to work and get back to normal life. But we're likely to see that there's going to be an increase in other categories like beauty and clothing and so on. Up, and certainly speaking to clients of ours who are in the beauty and aesthetics market, we're seeing that pre-bookings are going in place. People are excited about the prospect of salons opening, being able to spend time with their beautician. But it hasn't necessarily at the moment translated into sales at this particular point. It will be interesting to see the data next week. Now we've got the stores open, we're going to be comparing different categories and just seeing where that behavior is. And it might be that with the stores open, people are actually buying beauty products in store, but we'll give you an update on that next week. So a bit of fluctuation here in the numbers, but I think there's nothing really at this point to sort of determine any sort of clear direction of travel in this sector. But the UK is the 6th largest beauty market in the world. It's a really big industry. So I'd expect to see that bouncing back relatively soon, particularly as people have to socialise. It's going to become more important. But I suppose if you've got a mask, we'll see how that changes things. In terms of exercise, we've seen that the weather has certainly dampened engagement in intention. So the number of people who went for a walk every day, twice a day, or 3 times a week has decreased 3% on last week. That's likely to be due to the weather. That's certainly one hypothesis that we'd have. And for those living with their parents, they're more inclined to be watching pre-recorded videos at home, which makes sense. It's very much kind of the behaviour we generally tend to see in that type of younger audience. But I think what's interesting when it comes down to products and how people intend to buy exercise products in the future, this is one where we're seeing a huge movement to online. This is where 1 in 3 people who would normally buy in store are telling us they're gonna move that behaviour online, and you're just confident with buying sports goods, or perhaps less sort of precious about it. It becomes a decision that they're more than willing to make online. So it's an interesting one because we're certainly seeing much more of a solid movement in that regard, and it's also weighted very heavily to an older generation. So 53% of people 55 plus are that group who are going to move from stores to online. And when it comes to alcohol, the patterns are relatively stable compared to last week, but we are seeing some signs of growth. So we've got 20% of people this week claiming they've been drinking with others compared to last week, which was 16%. So there is certainly, a growth in that respect. And it's something I think obviously we need to, keep an eye on how that changes. I think it's going to be curious to see when jobs open up and people go back to work and sort of normal life, how that does change. But that's certainly been one story in this pandemic, is the change in consumption habits. And then, so how does this then play out reputationally? So we're looking at in our brand reputation, in our brand reputation studies, we're looking at how who's responding well to the pandemic, who's perceived well by customers, and it's interesting to see the results. So these, what I've highlighted here, are the top three that we've had each week, and you can see, Tesco have been consistently in that top three. Google have done pretty well too, as have Amazon, Sainsbury's, Asda, and Argos more recently improving there. But most retail brands overall are actually relatively flat, and in all cases, the perception of them in terms of the level of trust, as this data shows, has been declining each week. So something that clearly the pandemic has had an impact on trust scores. And like those who've been to these sessions before, we talk a lot about the relationship between trust and the response to the pandemic. So the better the response to the pandemic, or the perceived response to the pandemic from the point of view of the consumer, then the better your trust score is. And that is certainly played out in the data that we can see here. In terms of the bottom 10 brands, I think it's kind of interesting to see how that pattern plays out, because some of the worst performing brands we're seeing are airlines. Clearly, it's a sector that sort of struggled with kind of compensation, struggled with kind of corporate image and things like this. But I thought was really interesting is to look at Uber as a brand. It's one that's prior to the pandemic, it's one that was really struggling in terms of its perception. But we've seen it move from 21% to 27% in its trust score. It's actually it's bucked the trend compared to most brands. When we look at trust scores, it's actually done a lot better. And there's probably a bit of a squeezing in the middle, really, when we're looking at the data. We're seeing those kind of top brands that come out top. We've seen an evidence of a slight decline overall over time, whereas brands at the bottom, we have seen improvements over time. I thought it'd be interesting to focus on Primark, given that they're responsible for so much spend in the UK. Seeing how their performance has played out, it's been declining in terms of its perception as a response to the pandemic each week. But what we can observe is that with the stores opening this week, I'm sure it will be a slightly different story when people get to engage with the brand in ways that they were used to before the pandemic. So we'll be back to doing these Thursdays at 11 a.m. The next session will be week after next. I want to make sure the internet's all right before we do one of these again. And then we've got our ideas and innovation on the 14th of July. And that's it. I've tried to keep it relatively light and quick. Again, thanks for those of you that turned up today, and apologies for the internet outage. Not an ideal situation, but thanks for bearing with. Have a good day. Thank you very much.